She thought she could bully a child into submission until she messed with the wrong family. I was halfway through filing a federal indictment when my phone buzzed with a message that stopped my heart cold. "Mom! She's hurting him! Please come fast!" It was my daughter, Ella, 10 years old and confined to a wheelchair after a car accident that took her ability to walk but never touched her fire. Her older brother, Jordan, was her guardian angel 15, patient and fiercely protective. They were just going to the park 2 blocks from our house. A quiet day, supposedly. I bolted out the door, badge clipped inside my jacket, adrenaline already surging. The texts kept coming. "She's yelling at him. He didn't do anything." She slapped his phone away. By the time I reached the playground, a crowd had gathered. In the center stood a woman in tennis whites, with a clipboard tucked under one arm, shrieking at Jordan like he was a criminal. My daughter was crying. My son stood silent, face flushed, fists clenched. The woman didn't see me. Not yet. She had no idea who I was. But she was about to learn some lessons come hard, especially when you mess with a federal agent's family. Our neighborhood had the kind of name developers dream up in offices far from the land itself. Sycamore Glen. There wasn't a sycamore in sight, but there were plenty of rules. Trash bins had to be hidden by sunset, paint colors approved by committee, lawn lengths regulated like someone's life depended on it. And watching over it all was the HOA, led by a handful of residents who had somehow taken on the job of being everyone's unpaid enforcers. Among them was a woman named Cynthia Holloway. Most people just called her Karen behind closed doors, and it wasn't meant kindly. She was the kind of neighbor who introduced herself with a printed list of community guidelines and followed up with a clipboard. Her blonde bob never moved, even in the wind, and she dressed like she was always between a country club brunch and a Pilates class. I didn't have the time or interest to get to know her, but she'd made herself known to us in small ways over the years. The first time was when Ella was practicing navigating the sidewalk in her wheelchair. She wasn't blocking anything, just taking her time learning to handle the slope near the curb. Cynthia came out of her house with a frown so sharp it could cut glass, and asked if we knew our daughter was obstructing the walkway. Another time, Jordan was walking our dog and let him pause too close to her precious hydrangeas. That earned him a warning about leash length expectations. Nothing ever rose to the level of confrontation. It was always cloaked in the polite concern of someone who thought they were simply upholding standards, but I could see it clearly. There was a tightness in her smile when she looked at my children, like she was trying to force them into some mold they would never fit. I didn't let it get under my skin. I didn't have the luxury. I had real threats to deal with. Cynthia was just a suburban nuisance with a title and a clipboard. What I didn't realize, what none of us could have predicted, was how far she'd go when she thought no one was watching, or rather, when she thought no one could stop her. I wasn't always the kind of mother who double-checked every detail, who kept one eye on the world and the other on her children. But after the accident that put my daughter in a wheelchair, something inside me changed. Ella was only 7 when it happened, a drunk driver blowing through a stop sign on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Her spine took the worst of it, and the damage was irreversible. 3 years later, she'd learned to navigate life with steel will and aluminum wheels, always insisting she didn't need to be treated like glass. She was strong, sharp, and stubborn in ways that constantly reminded me of myself at her age. Her older brother Jordan, now 15, had taken on the role of protector without anyone asking him to. He watched over her at school, pushed her chair when her arms got tired, and stepped in when kids asked ignorant questions. Where Ella burned bright and fast, Jordan was the calm center she anchored to. He wasn't loud or showy, but he noticed everything. I used to wonder if it was too much to put on his shoulders, but he never seemed burdened. It was just who he was. I worked long hours in a job that didn't allow for softness, where mistakes could cost lives. But at home, I tried to keep things steady. We had a good rhythm, the 3 of us. I kept the ugly parts of my job out of their world, and they gave me reasons to smile every day. The neighborhood seemed safe enough. Quiet streets, well-kept lawns, kids on scooters in the cul-de-sac. It was the kind of place where people waved in the mornings and barbecued on weekends, or so it seemed. I knew there were politics under the surface, the kind that hid behind smiley newsletters and self-important rules, but I didn't pay much attention. I had more pressing concerns than who left their trash cans out too long. Still, I should have noticed the way certain neighbors looked too long when Ella passed by, or how some of them seemed to flinch when Jordan walked ahead of her. They never said anything directly, but I saw the tight smiles, the careful pauses. I didn't think much of it until the day everything changed. Our neighborhood had the kind of name developers dream up in offices far from the land itself. Sycamore Glen. There wasn't a sycamore in sight, but there were plenty of rules. Trash bins had to be hidden by sunset, paint colors approved by committee, lawn lengths regulated like someone's life depended on it. And watching over it all was the HOA, led by a handful of residents who had somehow taken on the job of being everyone's unpaid enforcers. Among them was a woman named Cynthia Holloway. Most people just called her Karen behind closed doors, and it wasn't meant kindly. She was the kind of neighbor who introduced herself with a printed list of community guidelines and followed up with a clipboard. Her blonde bob never moved, even in the wind, and she dressed like she was always between a country club brunch and a Pilates class. I didn't have the time or interest to get to know her, but she'd made herself known to us in small ways over the years. The first time was when Ella was practicing navigating the sidewalk in her wheelchair. She wasn't blocking anything, just taking her time learning to handle the slope near the curb. Cynthia came out of her house with a frown so sharp it could cut glass, and asked if we knew our daughter was obstructing the walkway. Another time, Jordan was walking our dog and let him pause too close to her precious hydrangeas. That earned him a warning about leash-length expectations. Nothing ever rose to the level of confrontation. It was always cloaked in the polite concern of someone who thought they were simply upholding standards. But I could see it clearly. There was a tightness in her smile when she looked at my children, like she was trying to force them into some mold they would never fit. I didn't let it get under my skin. I didn't have the luxury. I had real threats to deal with. Cynthia was just a suburban nuisance with a title and a clipboard. What I didn't realize, what none of us could have predicted, was how far she'd go when she thought no one was watching, or rather, when she thought no one could stop her. It was a Saturday that promised to be easy. The heat had broken overnight, and a soft breeze moved through the trees with a calm that made everything feel lighter. I had paperwork to finish, and a briefing call later that afternoon. But for once, there was nothing urgent clawing at my time. Ella wanted to go to the playground near the edge of the neighborhood, and Jordan offered to take her. He didn't mind pushing her chair the few blocks, and I trusted him completely. They packed snacks, water, and her favorite purple blanket. I watched them from the porch, Jordan steady as ever, Ella talking non-stop about a game she wanted to try on the swing set. It was one of the newer models, fitted with adaptive seats that let her experience the feeling of motion she missed. I'd fought hard with the HOA to get that swing installed. Cynthia hadn't liked it, said it wasn't in the budget. But I'd pressed, and the board eventually caved. They were only supposed to be gone for an hour. I remember checking the time, then opening my laptop. I could see the tops of the trees from the kitchen window, and I imagined them shaded under the tall branches while Ella laughed at one of Jordan's dry jokes. It felt good to let my guard down. What I didn't know was that Cynthia had been watching them too. She often walked the neighborhood with that clipboard of hers, pretending to take notes on fence repairs or lawn maintenance. But she had a habit of lingering near the park, especially when kids who didn't fit her picture of perfection showed up. That morning, she saw Jordan helping Ella out of her chair and into the swing. He adjusted the straps, checked the brakes, then stepped back with his phone in hand to take a photo. From across the lawn, Cynthia made her decision. She saw a teenage boy standing over a disabled girl, and her mind wrote a story that had nothing to do with reality. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was power, maybe it was something uglier. She crossed the field with purpose. Her voice cut through the air before she even reached them. Ella would later tell me that she saw Jordan's face shift, his shoulders go tight. He stepped between Cynthia and his sister, not aggressively, just instinctively. He had no idea that what started as a peaceful morning was about to turn into a scene none of us would forget. Cynthia didn't ask questions. She didn't approach like someone trying to understand. She came in like a storm already convinced of wrongdoing. Her voice was sharp, demanding to know what Jordan was doing and why he was taking pictures. He tried to explain, calmly, respectfully. He told her that Ella was his sister, that he had her permission, that it was just a photo for their mom. But Cynthia wasn't listening. She accused him of acting suspiciously, of taking pictures of someone else's child. Ella tried to speak up, but her voice cracked under the weight of panic. Cynthia pointed at her, saying things like, "It's okay, sweetheart, you don't have to be afraid," as if Ella was being held against her will. Jordan kept stepping in, trying to get her to stop, telling her again and again that they were siblings. Then Cynthia did something that made my son freeze. She reached for his phone. Not politely, not cautiously. She lunged and slapped it from his hand, sending it clattering across the pavement. Jordan's hands were in the air in an instant, eyes wide, mouth open in disbelief. He didn't retaliate. He didn't even raise his voice. But Ella started crying, full-on sobs that carried across the playground. Other parents looked up, some standing, unsure of what they were seeing. Cynthia turned to them, calling out that the boy was harassing a little girl. She waved her arms, her voice swelling with fake concern. The clipboard still dangled from her hand like a badge of imagined authority. Jordan bent to pick up his phone, and Cynthia stepped forward again. He moved fast this time, placing himself between her and Ella's chair. Not out of anger, but because he knew she was scared. Ella fumbled for her phone and sent the text to me. Her fingers were shaking, but she managed to type out enough to make it clear something was wrong. By the time she hit send, Cynthia was still shouting, Jordan was still silent, and the crowd was growing. I parked halfway on the curb and didn't bother locking the car. The second I stepped out, I could hear the commotion. Children's voices, raised adult tones, and the unmistakable sound of someone trying to assert control they didn't have. I moved fast across the grass, weaving through parents who stood in small clusters, watching but doing nothing. Cynthia's voice carried above the others. She stood in front of my son, red in the face, arms crossed, clearly believing she was in the right. Jordan stood still, his hands at his sides, face blank but his jaw tight. Ella sat behind him, clutching her phone and trying to stop crying. I stepped in between Cynthia and my children without saying a word. Jordan looked at me, and his whole body seemed to let go of some invisible weight. I turned to Cynthia slowly. "Is there a problem here?" I asked. She looked me up and down, not recognizing me as anything more than another parent. Her voice was clipped when she replied, accusing Jordan again of taking inappropriate photos, of making children uncomfortable, of refusing to leave when asked. I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. I only looked at her and said, "That's my son. That's my daughter in the wheelchair, and you need to step away from them right now." For the first time, her expression flickered. She looked at Ella, then back at Jordan. She tried to recover, claimed she was just protecting the children, that she didn't know they were siblings, that things had been misinterpreted. But her voice wasn't as steady as before. The crowd had grown quiet, watching us now with new eyes. Jordan didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He stood tall beside Ella, and I could feel how much he had held back. Cynthia still didn't know who I was, but that moment was coming, very soon. I didn't come to the park looking for a scene, but Cynthia had already made one. She tried to maintain her posture, chin lifted, voice firm, but I could see the uncertainty creeping in around the edges. Parents were still watching. Some had pulled their children close. A few had their phones out now, cameras angled low but clearly recording. I bent down and asked Ella if she was all right. Her voice shook, but she nodded. Jordan reached for her hand without saying a word. I stood and turned back to Cynthia. "You put your hands on my son's property," I said. "You struck the phone out of his hand. Did I hear that correctly?" Cynthia shifted her weight and narrowed her eyes. "I didn't strike anyone. I was trying to prevent a situation. He was acting suspicious. He refused to answer my questions." "He did answer," I said. "You just didn't like the answers." She opened her mouth to object, but I reached into my jacket and took out my credentials. I didn't flash them quickly like in movies. I held them steady, made sure she read every word, made sure everyone watching knew exactly what they said. Cynthia's face went pale. Her mouth twitched, but nothing came out right away. She looked from my badge to my eyes and back again. "I'm a federal agent," I said. "And you just harassed a minor. You made false accusations. You escalated a situation involving a disabled child. And you did it all while holding a clipboard like it gave you the right." She blinked. Once, twice. Then she said, "I didn't know. I didn't mean any harm." "That's never the excuse you think it is," I said. You thought you could control him. You thought no one would challenge you. But you were wrong. Her voice was much smaller now. I could see her processing the weight of her mistake, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. One of the parents had called the police. I hadn't asked for that, but I wasn't about to stop it either. When the officers arrived, Cynthia stepped forward quickly, her voice suddenly bright and eager. She pointed at Jordan, then at me, as if trying to reframe the story before it slipped entirely out of her hands. The officers didn't look convinced. I handed over my credentials and explained everything that had happened. Calm, direct, with no room for interpretation. I recounted how she had accused my son of wrongdoing without basis, how she had struck his phone, frightened my daughter, and tried to control the narrative by raising her voice and drawing attention to a false scene. Jordan confirmed every word. So did Ella, still wiping her cheeks but steady in her voice. A few of the other parents stepped up too. One mother said she had seen Cynthia slap the phone. Another said she heard Jordan clearly explain who he was and who Ella was. Cynthia's defense unraveled quickly. Her eyes darted between the officers, searching for sympathy that wasn't there. She tried to suggest that maybe she had overreacted, that things weren't clear, that she hadn't meant any harm. The officers asked her to step aside. One of them started writing a statement. At that point, 2 members of the HOA board arrived. They looked surprised to see so many people gathered, and even more surprised when I told them what had happened. I reminded them of the swing set Ella used, the one Cynthia had fought against. I asked them, in front of everyone, if this was the kind of leadership they stood behind. Neither of them answered right away. One of them mumbled something about needing to review the bylaws and complaints process. The other just looked at Cynthia and said he'd be calling an emergency meeting. No one was shouting anymore. Cynthia stood off to the side, no longer in control, no longer the loudest voice in the park. It was a long time coming, and it wasn't over yet. The official report from the police didn't mince words. Jordan was listed as the victim of harassment and minor assault. Cynthia was cited for disorderly conduct and interfering with a minor. It wasn't a serious charge on paper, but it would stay on record, and that mattered more than she realized. In the following days, the neighborhood started to shift. People who had once kept their distance now waved when they saw us. A few brought cookies or kind notes. One man apologized, saying he had seen Cynthia act out before but had never known how far she might go. The silence that had protected her for so long was starting to break. At the next HOA meeting, more residents showed up than ever before. It wasn't a coincidence. Word had spread. Videos from the park circulated quietly through neighborhood group chats. The board tried to hold the line, but the pressure was there. A petition to remove Cynthia from her position gained traction quickly. She tried to spin her version of events, but it was too late. The board placed her on administrative review pending further investigation. She kept a lower profile after that. No more clipboard walks, no more sharp questions about lawns or parking spaces. She walked past our house once but didn't look up. It wasn't about punishment, not really. It was about accountability, about making sure someone like her couldn't stand behind rules and roles to justify her behavior. Jordan didn't talk much about it afterward. He went back to school, back to his routines, carrying himself with the same quiet strength as always. Ella still went to the park, still used the swing, only now with more kids eager to talk to her, to include her. The balance had shifted. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. I sat with Ella and Jordan on the back porch a few evenings after everything settled. The sun was low, casting a soft orange light across the yard. Jordan leaned back in his chair, silent as ever, but more at ease. Ella was telling a story about a boy at the park who had asked if he could try her wheelchair. She had laughed, said no, then offered to race him instead. He lost. There was peace in that moment, a quiet I hadn't felt in a while. Not the uneasy calm that comes from holding things together, but the kind that follows after something has been set right. I looked at my children and saw exactly what Cynthia had missed. They weren't problems to be managed or obstacles in someone's perfect picture of suburbia. They were strong, kind, and capable of more than most people ever noticed. I thought about the job I do every day, the cases that keep me up at night, the people I work to protect. It never occurred to me I'd have to bring that same force home. That someone would look at my family and see only what they feared or didn't understand. What happened at the park could have ended differently. If Jordan had reacted with anger, if Ella hadn't sent that message, if I hadn't gotten there when I did. But none of that happened. Because my children knew who they were, and I knew what I had to do. Cynthia's influence was fading. The neighborhood had begun to speak up, not just for us, but for what was right. And while no policy or petition could erase what she did, the fallout made space for something better. We sat there until the sky turned dark, not talking much, just being together. That was enough. For now, it was more than enough.